Hey everybody, this video is going to go over the PowerPoint on pre-writing. So just like I mentioned in the video on the rhetorical situation, pre-writing is a step in the writing process that a lot of people skip as well. So in this PowerPoint, we're actually going to go through the steps of the writing process and some other things that might help you be more successful when you need to write something. And then at the very end, we'll get into the actual pre-writing techniques that you can use. So on the second slide, you get into the parts of the writing process. And there's actually 6 steps. So the first 3 are listed on this slide, and the other 3 are listed on slide 3. So on slide 2 here, we have the first 3 steps of the writing process: getting started, planning, and drafting. The next 3 steps are revising, editing and proofreading, and submitting. So I want to talk real briefly about each of those steps. Right? A lot of people think that they have a successful writing process, but if you really think about all of these steps once we go through them, I want you to ask yourself, how many of them do you actually go through when you write? How many do you skip? Because we skip a lot of them. And that might be why we don't feel like we're as strong a writer as we could be or should be. Knowing about the writing process and then utilizing each of the steps can help you be more successful and turn in quality writing, which is the goal. So the first step is getting started. This is where you need to make sure, especially if it's in a classroom setting, that you understand the assignment. Even if it's something that you're writing for your job, you still need to really understand what's expected of you, what you need to be doing. And understanding that, like really understanding it, can then help you make the right choices. Selecting a subject, right? So this goes back to the rhetorical situation, figuring out what your focus topic is. And then collecting information if necessary. If this is any type of research-based writing that you're doing, you're going to be doing the research pretty early on, possibly in that first step before you really think about what's going to actually go into the paper, right? So if there's any kind of research, you're going to be doing that in the first step as well. We tend to skip a lot of that first step. We don't really always pay attention to exactly what's expected of us in the assignment. We might briefly read it and think we know, and then we just dive right in. And sadly, there may have been some finer points in the instructions that you missed. And because of that, you might be going in the wrong direction from the very beginning. All right, so make sure you don't skip that part. Make sure you understand exactly what's expected of you. Don't skip the rhetorical situation part. Even if you don't write a whole lot down, at least think about it. Maybe use the pre-writing techniques we're going to discuss at the end of the PowerPoint to narrow in on that focused topic, that narrow topic, but you might not write down a whole lot for the other parts of the rhetorical situation, but don't forget about them. Consider them, think about them. And then, make sure you're doing your research beforehand. Don't make the mistake of trying to start writing and then doing your research after that, because it gets a little confusing, and the research might help you make decisions about what to include in the writing. The next step in the writing process is planning. So this is where you're going to start to form your thesis. And we talk about thesis statements a little later. This is where you're going to come up with your, method of development. Are you writing a compare-contrast? Are you writing a cause-effect? Is it argumentative? Is it simply informative? Is it a process analysis? Is it classification? Knowing if you are expected to use a specific method of development, you'll know then how you need to organize your paper. If it's totally up to you, then you need to figure out which one would be best for what topic you've chosen and what your purpose is, what you want to try to accomplish with the topic. It's where you're going to come up with a plan or an outline. So thinking about what your main points are going to be that you're going to discuss in the body of the paper. These things can change. They're not set in stone just because you think about them and write them down. You can change them at any point. But it's good to have a plan. It's good to have a thesis to start with. It's good to think about, what kind of essay you want to write, what will work best for you. And it's good to come up with a plan for your main points, an outline, right? Even if you change it later. Having it to start with can help guide you. It will lead you in a specific direction instead of feeling like you're all over the place. We skip this step a lot too. The third step is drafting. This is where you're going to start actually writing an introductory paragraph, writing the body paragraphs, writing the concluding paragraph. Most of us start at this step. This is step 3. We often skip some, if not all, of steps 1 and 2, and we just dive right in to writing. And if you do that, if you know that's how you often operate when you have to write something, I want you to ask yourself, do I feel comfortable writing papers? Do I tend to get good grades on them? Do I do well with them? If the answer is yes, and you've skipped steps 1 and 2, my guess is that you actually covered steps 1 and 2 in your head, right? You didn't need to do a whole lot of writing to get steps 1 and 2 figured out before you started drafting. And that happens. Depending on the topic, depending on the class, it's totally possible that you can formulate your topic and your plan and everything that you need to get started. You can do that mentally and then dive right into the drafting. But you actually did still complete those steps, just not on paper. If you are one of those people who really feels uncomfortable writing, you don't think you're very good at it, you always feel like you cannot get your thoughts organized, that you tend to ramble, you tend to be all over the place, you don't always get the best grades on those papers, ask yourself if it might be because you don't spend any time planning before you get started. And saying that these are, steps 1 and 2, that does not imply that each step should require the same amount of time and energy as all the rest. That's not the case. It's not that you need to spend a ton of time in steps 1 and 2. Just don't skip them entirely. It might not take you very long to figure these things out. But if you just skip it, then you start drafting, it can feel very overwhelming. So once you draft, you move on to step 4, which is revising. Revising is not looking for spelling and grammar issues. Revising is looking at the bigger picture, right? We'll cover this more in depth in a later module. But right now you just need to know that when we talk about revising, we're talking about improving the overall paper, the ideas that are in it, how it's organized. If you need more support for any section, if the tone hasn't come out right, things like that, the overall quality of the paper. We tend to skip that step too. We think once we've got our intro, our body paragraphs, and our conclusion, the only thing we need to change are the little teeny tiny errors along the way. But no, just because you have that introductory paragraph written does not mean it cannot be revised and improved upon. And in most cases, it will need to be revised and improved upon, right? Same thing with the other parts of the paper. The fifth step is editing and proofreading, and that's when you get into those smaller details, making sure that you've got the right style, that you don't have any spelling and grammar issues, the little things. Because the thing is it doesn't matter how perfect your spelling is or how perfect your grammar is if the ideas in the paper aren't solid. So that's why revising is dealing with those bigger issues first before you start looking for those little issues, because those little issues won't matter if the bigger issues aren't good, right? The sixth step then is submitting, and this might seem like a silly thing to make submitting an actual step in the writing process, but you do have to think about how you are supposed to submit it. Was it supposed to be in a certain style? If it was research based, do you have everything in APA format? If there's a presentation to go along with it, if there's a PowerPoint to go along with it, a video, something like that, like, do you have all the components necessary before you turn it in? Okay, so 6 steps. Most of us really only think about 2 most of the time, the drafting and the editing and proofreading, but the other 4 steps are just as important. They may not take as much time, but they are equally important. Okay. On slide 4, we get into more theory about that writing process. Don't think that it follows a straight path. Just because we listed in 6 steps does not mean that you go through each step one at a time and then you're done. Sometimes you have to go back. Sometimes it circles around a few times before you get where you want to be to finally turn it in. Each assignment will present different challenges. So in some cases, you might actually spend a lot of time in steps 1 and 2, simply coming up with an idea, narrowing it down, doing your research if that's included, coming up with your thesis, coming up with your organization plan. Sometimes that takes a while. And then once you get it figured out, you actually draft it pretty quick. The ideas just flow. Other times, those first 2 steps are going to come like that. You're gonna get the assignment and you are gonna have a light bulb moment, and it's gonna be like, oh my gosh, I know exactly what I want to write about. I know exactly what my main points are gonna be. I'm good to go. And then you can get right into drafting. Other times you have to go back and forth. You start, drafting, and then you realize, maybe I need to do a little bit more research on this part. So you go do more research, and then that research kind of changes what you end up wanting to write about. So then you go back, you're like, okay, well now I need to rethink this again. I need to go through this. What's my thesis going to be now? How am I going to organize it now? It's recursive. It's not linear. Even though we list them in a linear fashion, the process can be very messy. All right? Everyone works differently. Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses, and you will have your own at different points in time. And the biggest thing that you need to just remember is realize that there are 6 parts of the writing process, and that it's in your best interest to at least think about each step along the way. On step 5, or slide 5, it's just a reminder to make sure that you have thought about the rhetorical situation before you get into your too far into your process, and keep thinking about it. Keep coming back to it along the way. As you're drafting, am I still on my focus topic? Am I thinking about my angle and what I'm bringing to the table that makes all of this different and fresh? Am I remembering my purpose? If my purpose is to persuade my readers, am I really doing that with my writing? Have I continued to remember who my audience is? Am I using the appropriate language and tone? So thinking about audience and context. You want to do it at the beginning, but you want to keep coming back to it throughout the process. The next slide, on slide 6, just some common traits of college writing. Things that you need to keep in mind when you are working on any kind of formal assignment in a class. We expect strong ideas. We expect logical organization, an engaging voice, clear word choices, sophisticated, academic, appropriate word choices, smooth sentences, correct writing. Um, you are learning, but you want to show us that you're learning in a professional way. The next few slides get into specifics of assignments. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's here for you to go through, refer back to if necessary. But it basically goes through the different types of keywords that might show up in a writing assignment. Like, if you're asked to analyze something, make sure you know what analyze means. If you're asked to compare, contrast, make sure you know what that means. If you're asked to classify, make sure you know what that means. There's a few slides there that go through those different types of keywords that can be used in assignments. And it's just a little refresher for you to make sure you understand what each one means, because if you're being asked to compare and contrast, but that's not what you actually end up doing in your paper, that could cause you a lot of problems down the road. And then finally on slide 11, we start to get into the pre-writing techniques. Okay, so the list there of pre-writing techniques, we've got self-questioning, and there is an example of that on page 10 of the book, but there's also an example on the slides. Directed free writing, there's an example of that on pages 11 and 12, as well as here in the PowerPoint. Mapping and clustering, and there's an example of that on pages 13 and 14, but also in the PowerPoint. And then brainstorming and listing. There's not really an example of that in the book, but I do have an example of it here in the slides. Okay, so questioning is exactly what it sounds like. 5 journalistic questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Answer those to the best of your ability regarding the topic that you're thinking about working with. And just, if you have the answers, that's great, but asking the questions can help guide you to what you want to actually include in your paper. Okay. The next one is a directed free write. So free writing is what my goal is for your journals each week. You set a timer for yourself, and you're usually given a topic. You set a timer for yourself for 10 minutes, and you just write nonstop. Even if you go off topic, even if you repeat yourself, don't worry about your spelling, don't worry about your grammar, don't worry about anything. Just write and keep writing. And then when time's up, look over what you have. There'll be some really interesting ideas that came about. But it's just to get your thoughts out with no pressure, no rules, nothing. Just get the thoughts on the screen or on the paper if you're writing, handwriting. The next kind of pre-writing technique is very popular, especially for those who like visual learning. It's the clustering, or webbing, or mapping, you might have also heard it referred to. Here we call it clustering. I give you 2 examples there. You start off with the main idea in the middle bubble. So for the example on the left-hand side, it's the writing process. And then there is another level of smaller circles that come off of that main circle. So in this case, we've got pre-writing, first draft, revision, proofreading, publishing. So those are all the things that came to this person's mind when they started thinking about the writing process. And they knew that each of those things was a separate part of the process, so that's why they put them in the smaller bubbles coming off of the main one in the middle. But each of those smaller bubbles has different things going on with it too. So pre-writing involves free writing, outlining, clustering. It also involves research. But research involves a lot of different things too. Going to the library, using the internet, doing an outline, doing interviews, right? So the idea is to get everything out on paper in a visual form, but try to group things as you go. Why is that helpful? Well, let's look over at the other example. The other example on the right side, the big circle in the middle is about pollution. So if you're writing a paper and it's going to be about pollution, that's a large topic. So you need to start coming up with some more focused, more narrow aspects of this topic. So we have water pollution and air pollution. And for water pollution, we've got causes, effects, and solutions. For air pollution, causes, effects, and solutions. And when you group all of those items together, anything that has to do, and you might not come up with them in this, all at once. So like, when I'm thinking about water pollution and I'm thinking about the causes, I might have only thought of oil spills at first. And then I moved on to the effects, and I might have only thought about, sick fish, and then as I kept making my clustering, I realized, oh, you know what? Another cause of sewage might be, or causes of water pollution might be raw sewage. So I go back to that area and add that as a little offshoot of causes of water pollution. And same thing, I might be at another point coming up with ideas and think, oh, you know what? Another effect is not just fish and things in the water. People too. People are affected by water pollution. So I come back to that area and do a little offshoot from effects, So it's not that you have to think of everything all at once when you're in that section. It just gives you a place to come back to so that it's not all over the place, right? Not everybody's mind works this way, so clustering really might not be the best pre-writing technique for you, but if you can work it, it's so helpful, because then you have this really nice visual to look at and think, okay, I know I can't cover pollution in general. So do I want to do air pollution or water pollution? Well, let's go with air pollution. All right, so I'm looking at the top part of this clustering here, and it's like, wow, I've got causes, effects, and solutions. I got a lot of solutions listed there. That might be too much too, just to talk about air pollution. Even that's too big. So do I want to focus on the causes? Maybe that's what my essay is going to be about. And then I've got these nice three little, main points. If I want my whole essay to be about causes of air pollution, my main points would be factories, coal plants, and car exhaust. Right? If I decide I want to talk about the solutions, I want to talk about solutions to air pollution. Well, we've got better engines, hydropower, wind power, and EPA laws. My main points are already there. I can look right at it and see, and I can start to visualize how I'm going to organize my main points. Okay? That's why clustering can be very helpful. But not everybody works that way. I tend to do this sometimes. Most of the time, though, I use the last technique, which is brainstorming or listing. Okay? It's a lot like free writing in that there's no rules, right? Don't have to worry about spelling, grammar, language, any of that. The difference, though, is that you're not even confined to writing sentences. With a free write, you're kind of writing sentences. But with brainstorming, with listing, it's literally just words or phrases that you're jotting down. The drawback to it is there's no rhyme or reason to it. You're just jotting things down as they enter your mind, and it's usually on the next line. Whereas with clustering, what comes to your mind, if you've already got an area for that, you can go to that smaller bubble and stick it in that area. With listing, it's just straight down the page. So you have to go back afterwards and kind of sort through everything and figure out what could get grouped together. Sometimes what I've done is I've done the brainstorming and the listing first, because that's how my mind works. And then I take that list and I create a cluster based on the items that are on the list. And then I get the visual that helps me think about how I want to organize my main points. So you figure out what pre-writing technique works best for you. And you might even come up with something that's not listed, that doesn't really apply to any of these four options that I've put in this PowerPoint. Or you might kind of combine and mix and match. There might be some assignments where you use one technique and other assignments where you use a different technique. But don't skip the pre-writing, because that is where you generate your ideas. That's where you come up with the content of your paper. It's where you help yourself get to that focused topic, your main points, and how you think you want to organize it. Again, all those things can change, but if you have an idea from the very beginning, it will be much smoother sailing than if you skip this step completely. Because skipping this step is one of the reasons why people feel so lost, so overwhelmed, all over the place, like they ramble in their papers. Okay, so really, truly think about using the pre-writing techniques and thinking about the writing process from start to finish, um, and knowing that even though you might not spend a lot of time on each step, you at least want to address each step along the way. Okay? If you have any questions about the writing process or the pre-writing techniques, let me know.